The first strike is rarely the loudest moment, it is the quiet decision that precedes it, a calculation made in a closed room, a red line interpreted, or misinterpreted, and sometimes, history shifts not because someone wanted a global war, but because too many systems were already aligned for one. The idea of a single strike triggering a world war sounds dramatic, unreal, distant, but global conflict is not born from drama, it emerges from structure. Consider the architecture of modern power. The United States has built an expansive web of military alliances, financial dominance through the dollar, and forward-deployed deterrence across continents. Its strength is not just in weapons, but in networks, NATO commitments, defense treaties, integrated economies. On the other side, a different network has been consolidating. BRICS, an economic bloc initially framed as an alternative financial forum, has evolved into something more layered, not a military alliance, not a unified command, but a gravitational field. BRICS connects major economies like China, Russia, India, Brazil, and South Africa, each with distinct interests, internal tensions, and global ambitions. What binds them is not ideology, but a shared discomfort with Western-centric financial systems and sanctions regimes. Pause there, because this is where the structure becomes interesting. If the United States were to strike a BRICS-aligned power, or vice versa, the response would not depend solely on military capability. It would depend on how each member interprets its own strategic incentives. Would they see it as an attack on a partner, or as an opportunity to reshape global leverage? Global war in the 21st century would not begin with marching armies across borders. It would begin with financial systems freezing, supply chains tightening, cyber infrastructure flickering offline, energy routes would become bargaining chips, semiconductors would become pressure points, military escalation would be only one layer of a much deeper contest. And here is the tension few acknowledge. BRICS is not a unified military bloc like NATO. Its members often compete with each other. China and India share border disputes. Russia's priorities do not always align with Brazil's economic interests, so would one strike truly unify them, or would it expose fractures? The same question applies to America's alliances. Security guarantees are powerful, until they are tested. Deterrence works on belief, and belief can erode. The nightmare scenario is not a synchronized global declaration of war. It is incremental escalation, a strike, a retaliation calibrated to send a message. Sanctions, counter-sanctions, naval repositioning framed as defensive, cyber responses that are officially denied. Each move justified, each response measured, until suddenly, the system is operating on momentum. History shows that world wars rarely begin because leaders desire total annihilation. They begin because leaders assume the other side will stop. Assumptions become strategy, strategy becomes escalation, and escalation becomes difficult to reverse. But there is another dimension. Nuclear deterrence still exists, not as an abstraction, but as a structural ceiling. Major powers understand that direct confrontation carries existential risk. That understanding has, for decades, restrained open conflict, so the more plausible scenario is not immediate World War III, it is sustained. Multi-domain confrontation, economic fragmentation, parallel financial systems, competing trade corridors, arms buildups justified as defensive stabilization. A world that slowly reorganizes into hardened blocks, without ever formally declaring a global war. The question, then, is not whether one strike could trigger WW3 in the cinematic sense, it is whether one strike could accelerate a shift already underway. Because global order does not collapse in a single moment, it erodes, confidence in shared systems weakens, neutral states feel pressured to choose sides. Institutions built for cooperation become arenas for vetoes and deadlock. And the most destabilizing factor is uncertainty. If a crisis emerges between America and a BRICS power, every capital will be watching not just the strike, but the response. Will markets panic? Will allies hesitate? Will secondary powers exploit distraction? These reactions matter more than the initial blow. War in the modern era is less about battlefield victory and more about systemic endurance. Who can absorb pressure longer? Who can maintain internal stability? Who can prevent allies from drifting? A single strike does not automatically create a world war, but in a tightly interconnected system, militarily, economically, digitally, it can expose fault lines that were already under strain, and once exposed, those lines do not simply disappear, they harden. So perhaps the more unsettling question is not whether one strike could trigger World War III, it is this: how many reinforcing assumptions are holding the current order together, how much of global stability rests on expectations that have never truly been tested, and if those expectations fail, even once, who decides what comes next? The future may not hinge on a single missile, it may hinge on interpretation, on restraint, on whether leaders and societies recognize the difference between deterrence and provocation before the system tips, look beyond the headlines, examine the incentives, question the narratives that make escalation sound inevitable. Because in a world defined by interconnected power, the most dangerous moment is not the strike itself, it is the belief that escalation can be controlled once it begins. What do you think holds the current order together, and what might quietly be pulling it apart?